Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pam Cowan, and I'm the Director of Membership and Marketing at APPA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, our Public Power X Webinar, Secure Frictionless Customer Service During COVID-19 and Beyond, which is hosted by LexisNexis. If anyone is having any trouble hearing the audio or experiences any technical difficulties, please email membership@publicpower.org, and we'll do everything we can to get you sorted out quickly. The phone lines have been muted to reduce background noise. To make this webinar as interactive as possible, we encourage you to type your questions and comments into the chat box at the bottom right hand of your screen at any time, and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. Immediately following the webinar, you'll be asked to fill out a brief survey. We appreciate any comments you may have on the webinar and suggestions for future topics. Within 24 hours, you will receive an email that contains a link to the slides and a recording of this webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenter, George Freeman, Government Solutions Consultant with LexisNexis Risk Solutions. George?
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, I'm glad we were all able to carve out some time and enjoy a pretty nice presentation we got in store for you. Go ahead and do the next slide. Just some housekeeping notes. We're going to have a recording of the presentation that will be emailed out to all registrants within 24 hours. Q&A, I can't stress it enough. If you want to participate, feel free. There's a chat box on the right side of your screen where you can enter questions and submit them. We will have ample time for discussion at the end of this session. And at the close, we'll encourage you to complete a brief survey. If you can, just give some feedback and tell us what you think. And next slide, please. And next slide. Okay, what tipped this off was a report that went out last month. I don't know if our audience has had a chance to see it, but definitely affects your industry. What we saw was the NSA and CISA put out a cybersecurity advisory. And it's really a byproduct of COVID-19 in that remote management has become paramount for continuing of operations. Many organizations across the globe have faced this and are being successful about it. We've been able to adapt as the conditions have taken on, and life's good. Long story short, what is in that report is very important and should be taken note by not only the IT teams and so forth and the power companies, but even customer service, and realize that portals that customers use but could potentially have some concerns around this. We're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about what we can do about it, and we're going to talk about digital identity and get into some details on that. But long story short, internet accessible devices is what this is about. 16 critical infrastructure sectors was described in the report, and really operational technology used. These assets were not designed to defend against malicious cyber attacks, and the idea is they're public facing. And to give you an idea of what was in that report, things like they talk about spear phishing. We're still seeing, unfortunately, targeted email. It does use very powerful social engineering. It gets people to think it came from a trusted source. The idea is they click on something and all of a sudden they're having a bad day. And what ends up happening next, of course, malware, any kind of malicious scripts take over, and whatever privileged or protected resources they're connected to, even over VPN, could potentially now be exposed, which is a very, very serious concern, because what we're talking about ultimately could impact our critical infrastructure. They even mentioned ransomware, and I know that one has been more of a headache to a lot of the IT security teams, and they're worried about, well, okay, that's just damage and we need to restore for backup. Well, it turns out the ransomware now is changed a little bit, and I don't know if you've been keeping up, but they are actually exfiltrating data along with encrypting and essentially holding in unreadable form all of the critical data that organizations use. So because exfiltration is going on, that's a real concern, in that what it is they're stealing, we don't know. And now it's in the hands of the bad guys, and it's not a good day after that. So again, these are things to be aware of going forward. Next slide, please. Now, I did have a fortunate experience in that this is going back about a year and a half ago. I've been on board with LexisNexis a little over a year. I got a cybersecurity background, about 20 years plus, everything from mitigation solutions to identity management, compliance, even cloud security. But I was doing some compliance work, and this goes back about a year and a half, with a nonprofit power company. Let's just say it was somewhere in the Southeast US. And it was a stretch because they were so overworked and it was so difficult to get these folks on the phone. When we finally did, we just figured out, we need to help you guys and let's figure out something. So what we did was he essentially bundled together some services hours and made it possible for me to be on site for a few days and really talk to their team, get down to the guts of, what their challenges are. And the end result was, we end up seeing some, shall we say, interesting problems. And what you're seeing on the screen there is typical remote access. Okay, vendors will client VPN in. Even customer support folks, everybody's working from home. VPN, that's great. Unfortunately, with vendors, especially, they were given access to a jump box. And what that is, it allows the vendor to then use an internal resource to then connect to other resources. And often that happens essentially uninhibited. They figure, well, we vetted the contractor and everything should be fine. And, what could go wrong? Well, then you're really at the mercy of the security internally. And that means maybe we've got some sensitive databases and some other repositories, not of just customer information, but it could inadvertently get back to the critical infrastructure side of the house, the SCADA networks and so forth, which we certainly don't want to see. So again, that was one alarm that came out of it. Another one was laptops in trucks, and what we ended up seeing there was devices that come in remotely. And they connect over VPN. In this case, they're hitting these DMZs, that stands for demilitarized zone, but I think of that as a work area for the IT resources. Again, if you're contracting in, or in the case of the trucks, they're trying to hit a resource they need to get to. The theory is that, again, they're vetted ahead of time and everything should work the way it's designed to work, except for those unthought of scenarios. And one would be, what if the laptop's stolen? It does physically sit in a truck. That was a concern. And what could they do after that? And really that lines up with some of the challenges we have today, in that, the security teams often have been focused on, the unknown threats. Who are these bad guys? Who are we trying to defend against? And what they often do is really almost operate in a reactive mode. So your security operations centers, SOC teams are looking for these unknown threats. They're trying to piece them together. They look at things like threat intelligence. And that's a very interesting aspect because that does play a role with identity, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But the important thing is they're looking for this unknown over here. But meanwhile, unfortunately, 80–90% of your threat is going to be your own people. It's the malicious authorized users that are really the significant threat right now. And especially in this COVID or post-COVID period that we're in, where the world is essentially working remote. That's a real challenge, because what we did to get these users onboarded was we vetted them properly, background checks and whatnot, and gave them access through whatever we've got, Federation or other security services, and they get to the protected resources so they can do their job. But it blindly assumes after that it's that person that we said would connect. We're trusting the individual. Everything should work the way it should. And again, what could go wrong? Next slide, please. Well, here comes the AMI network. So what we're doing is the advanced metering infrastructure has been going into place. And this is a great thing. I mean, I actually have solar power generation on my roof. They put in a net meter. It's part of the smart meter network. Pretty cool stuff. It tells you a lot of good information. It also facilitates this thing called remote disconnect, which saves a lot of resources. The last thing the power companies want to do is send out a truck just to disconnect the power. Then the subscriber is suddenly without power. They call up, say, hey, please put my power back on. I'll pay my bill, I promise. And then they have to send the truck out again. So again, a lot of overhead there that they were trying to avoid. Great, good thing. Here come the smart meters. Everything's great. And often, it's real time. So we got sub 15-minute kind of thing. And it's tied in with a billing and payment system. So what's interesting there is, you fail to pay your bill. They put you on the prepay at the pump. routine, which is kind of interesting. So you have to pay for your electricity up front, and then they bill against it. It's, again, these are all good, solid, positive results of this new technology. And again, don't have to worry about sending the trucks out. But the question comes up is, doesn't billing ultimately have some kind of access to the AMI network? And that was what did start to come about. And that's leading down an interesting path. Next slide, please. So what we have now are these current threats. We've got smart grid in place. It's really doing a great job. However, we're also seeing this increased exposure to the utilities. Cyber attacks include South Korea. They got a nuke plant down there that was broken into. They think potentially by North Korea. Again, there's this potential for some political action they may take on trying to control their resources. We heard about Ukraine. There were actually two breaches that took place, both in 2015 and 2016. They hit the power distribution network, which is pretty darn serious from what I understand. I'm not a power guy, but they said they essentially hit it right at the heart. Interesting factoid here, in 2019, the U.S. Western transmission grid was hit as well in a cybersecurity incident, but did not really go into much detail because they, again, DHS tried to keep it quiet. They didn't want to promote it as something that, you know, the world could hear about, like, oops, so we're not going to go there. However, with COVID-19 remote access, what we're seeing there, again, these portals are being turned up to allow for functionality to take place remotely. Things that, again, it's higher exposure, and you have this threat that's building. So what we've done essentially is increase the attack surface. That's what the cyber guys call it. And that's a real problem logistically, because when you've done that, then your chances for an incident are going to be even higher. Years ago, what a lot of the SOC teams and cybersecurity folks would do is they would look at the threats coming in, and what they were trying to do was detect the threat before it did any damage. So we got into this mode of detection and response. So they would tie in the incident response teams, everything would go great if everything was rehearsed. So they were pretty much ready to go. You know, the guns were loaded and just in case, so we're ready. The challenge with that design, and they learned the hard way, is too many organizations get hit, a breach takes place, and they don't know about it, in some cases for months. Every year there's a report that comes out by PonyMine, IBM sponsors it, and it talks about the breach impact to the world, and they talk about data breaches. And they still have durations of now in excess of 6 months where an organization discovers there was a breach. And really, more realistically, you have to be in a mode of, it's not a question if, it's a question of when. When are we going to have a breach? And what's going to happen, and how are we going to, deal with it? And what we're seeing more and more of is the bad guys are going after identity as their source of getting in now. It's, they've tried to do all these I would say clever techniques. I always describe security as a moving train. You never want to get off. And again, they keep changing the threat vectors, and now identities become huge. And you could probably put 2 and 2 together after we heard about the Equifax data breach. Well, that was huge. Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of identities for Americans, and that's a problem. Where did it go is the next question. Who has access to this identity information? And what we're finding more and more of is the identities are bought and sold. There's a currency out there called Bitcoin. It's not tied to any bank. It's not even tied to any identities. They just use it for payment in the underground world, and they can fuel this economy that's pretty much cashing in on vulnerabilities at organizations. So again, our power companies are sitting with a concern of vulnerability, especially in the nonprofit space, where when I did this project, they were, really just trying to figure out what to do given the limited resources that they had. And that's really what it boils down to. And what you're seeing with customer portals, this is the thing you really want to be paying attention to. An authorized user. We're assuming that that's the vetted user we onboarded or gave access or privilege to their account and so forth. All of a sudden, they somehow go further than just going to their account information. Somehow they found a weakness. And the portal itself, maybe there were some patches that haven't been applied in time. Again, that's a two-edged sword with security. We see this quite often, where vulnerabilities are discovered. The industry reacts, the vendors put out the patches. We're hoping that they patch them diligently and quickly. The challenge, though, is testing them, because in some, well, shall we say too many cases, when the patches are applied, the applications will break. And when that happens, now you're down. It's worse than being, well, not worse than being breached, but almost as bad. And the idea is we're trying to avoid that downtime. So they're going to test it and see what they can do if something does in fact break. So there's a gap in time. So we have these unpatched systems, or at least they're not on the latest stuff. And the authorized users that are going in maybe are poking around, potentially looking for those published vulnerabilities. Okay, now let's think about this. They're in your portal, and somehow they've gotten around the limitations of a normal user. Now they've gotten back to the user database. Didn't we say, though, that if the user didn't pay his bill, they could turn off their power through their smart meter? Interesting. So let's think about this. The bad guy gets in. Now they're able to kill the power. Maybe not to one, but maybe send out a batch command to all accounts. And while he's at it, let's think about what other access they could have. They potentially could wipe the keys on the smart meter itself. That essentially bricks it. And now you've got not just an outage that you have, epic proportions, but you got a duration now that's going to be much higher than anybody even thought about, because the devices won't come back up. Now you're going to be sending out trucks to every single device to replace them. Again, because that's what we refer to as the perfect storm. That's what we absolutely do not want to see. So again, this increased capability combined with this COVID environment that we're working in is brewing something that we're very concerned about. It does boil back to identity. Let's talk about that next. So next slide, please. What we're talking about, first of all, is can we figure out whether or not this authorized user that's coming in meets the requirements coming in? And the way we do that is we define what's called digital identity. And we're looking for digital identity assurance, which is saying, okay, George, we see that it's your iPhone coming in, but is this really you? Or is it your device in use by somebody else? Was it stolen? Was it cloned? Does it have a remote access Trojan? There's all these things that could be going wrong to increase the risk. But the way we define digital identity assurance is we have to look at what aspects of the identity we're going to trust. We're going to look at things like name, address. That's some PII pieces. A little bit more to the device attributes. Look at those. We'll get into IP geolocation. Okay, that's pretty cool. We can do that and figure out where they're coming in from. Maybe we need to look through whether or not there's a hidden proxy or some other techniques where they're hiding their address, like that never happens. So when they report themselves as coming in from, say, California, but they're really coming in from Eastern Bloc or Russia or Asia somewhere, that's clearly bad. And that's something we want to be able to look at and run against some rules and make a decision based on the risk that our organization is going to be able to tolerate. And that's a good thing, because look at what else we can look at. We can look at the device itself. We can actually create these block or safe lists now, which is tremendous. And especially with power companies that may want to share that information, you can create something called a consortium. We're going to look at how to do that. And potentially, this could lead to things like we could tie it in with sanction lists and maybe even do document verification. What that will happen is the digital identity will become a workflow. And that's a great way to think about it. We're going to vet the identity at the front door, and then we're going to decide whether or not we're going to let the identity in to actually authenticate and connect back to resources. And the way we're going to do that, the best way to define, kind of think about how this whole digital identity piece will work, is to come up with a way to crowdsource it, to contribute to, say, a global network that anonymizes the information in such a way that you can ask it if it's seen the identity before and seen any risk associated with it, but there's no other readable data to do that. So we're going to look at that next. So let's talk about common threats to digital services. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we've got here, fraudsters using stolen identities. Okay, we talked about the Equifax data breach. Direct result. They can buy these identities, by the way. I tracked some interesting interviews with some bad guys who made some deals with law enforcement, and sometimes you can pull a few of them off YouTube. And sure enough, there was a guy interviewed, and he was saying, yeah, he just goes out to Yahoo groups, like Yahoo's even still around, but apparently they are. And they literally, in certain groups, end users will advertise, hey, I've got credit card lists, I've got identity lists over here. And then you make little deals and buy and sell the stuff. What ends up happening next is they'll take that list they purchased and they'll write a script and they'll start pushing this out to a botnet. We've heard about those because of all the malware and all the things that created these botnets. And this is where the bad guys are really residing. And this is why it's become so concerning. It's because the bad guys have not only created their own network, but they have the ability to deploy all sorts of resources globally. And we see this as bot level attacks. We also see attacks involving credential stuffing. And what that means is they purchased a list, they threw it in a script, they're trying every one of these known accounts with usernames and passwords in them and see what happens and see what happens next. And that's a real challenge if you think about it. A lot of the portals that allow customers in don't really check for these kinds of things. We do find that a lot of them, especially cloud-hosted resources, they'll put a web application firewall out front. Okay, great. And it's supposed to be able to stop bots. And I've heard this time and again. I used to be in the firewall and intrusion prevention space. And it's only good up to a point because you're asking a machine to detect another machine. And what we've got is this new kind of logic that's showing up where these bots really do have patterns that look as if they're human beings in a way, in many cases. So what's happening is the web application firewall, or WAF, is becoming less and less useful because of its ability to detect whether or not there's a bot and possibly mitigate it. And here's the other problem. I have, customers and IT teams I was talking to, and what they think they can do is put in this, loopback system. So what'll happen is, okay, what they think is a bot coming in, oh, well, okay, we think we detected it. Now we're going to add that bot to a bad IP address list. Okay. The reason that doesn't work anymore is these botnets we talked about have address space all over the globe, meaning they won't have to reuse a source address at any time they come in. That's just a given. So putting them on a block list at a IP address level is no longer effective. And that's a real challenge. So bots is one thing. Another one, of course, when employees come in, let's say you got a call center that's dispersed amongst everyone's coming in from home, so they're all tied in over VPN. Now you're dealing with the home network threats, and that's going to be a real headache. So we've got to look at those details of what's going to affect those networks first before they even connect and get into that mode. We also see credentials being used to create fake identities. Okay, that's what they call a synthetic identity. And this is where, an account's created and it really doesn't belong to a real person. And what they end up doing is, creating a scenario where money can be either, we see this especially in money laundering schemes. That's very common. So part of our identity workflow needs to be able to look at the identity itself and compare the name, address, phone, all of that against, say, 10,000 data sources. Again, using the linking technology that would be able to pinpoint that, is this in fact George Freeman, or does it fall apart because the street name is inconsistent, the phone number is inconsistent, the geolocation this entity came in from is inconsistent, and we can fail it right there. We can flag it as high risk. So again, that's when a workflow begins to work towards solving this problem. So that's a good thing. Okay, next slide, please. Now, how do we do this? Digital identity really will only be effective if we have the ability to tie into this global network and maybe crowdsource it. And really think of what's going on right at the moment. We're seeing fraud all over the globe. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could collect attributes out of the device in a way somewhat fingerprinting it? Now, you'll hear the term device assessment, and this is a very common thing with vendors. I've actually heard that term go back even in the mid-2000s. So it's been a while. And what they would do back in the day was they'd check, okay, this is George's laptop coming in, and we can see he's running Windows 10 and everything's good there. They check the anti-malware, see if that's up to date, if he's running all of his security patches, and if his if his end device is compliant. That's one of the definitions of, device assessment. But that is an old definition and a very ineffective one, because you can have a very compliant device come in, doesn't necessarily mean it's physically in the hands of the user that you assume it is. It could be stolen. It could be replicated, cloned, again, or have remote access enabled on it that they didn't realize. So what we need to do is take a step further. And what we're going to do is crowdsource this information. So as a device comes in, it'll be actually checked. And we're going to collect the attributes out of the device using a script and securely bring that back and create hash results and store it in a way that you can only look it up by comparing a hashed result of something you just collected to one that maybe this digital identity network has seen globally. And then we're going to multiply that across, say, 6,500 plus customers in all sorts of industries and geographies. What you'll end up with is this tremendous visibility that you didn't have. And this is really where I want to drive this whole discussion home. How do we solve this problem, George? This is the way we're going to do it. We need to be able to have a global digital identity network that we can use to really to check ahead of time that this device coming in, this user that it claims to be coming from, is in fact, the identity that we assumed it was. That's identity assurance. So again, we're trying to figure out, is this George coming from what appears to be George's iPhone or George's laptop? Okay, great. If the workflow is set up properly, you can actually then check these attributes, compare them to what's known in this digital identity network, and it'll tell you some really amazing things. It'll come back and say, not only did we find some things that were concerned because maybe there's he's coming out of a Tor exit node, or he's got a remote access Trojan running on the device. Those would be pretty simple to catch, but we're going to go a step further. In that digital identity, we're going to look at the digital history. Where's this device been in the last 24 or 48 hours, in the last week? We can actually look back months. And that's important because not only are we going to look at that device, but we're going to see all the other devices tied to that identity. That's a significant step forward. What we now have is an exposure of a true identity. It's no longer a device assessment. We've actually now taken in and evolved that idea up to an identity level. That's a very, very powerful tool to have access to. Because when you now see the whole picture, you've got the digital history of all the other devices that this digital identity was using. And things come out of that. And you start to see personas, for one thing. You can actually see that, well, certain devices are coming in, it looks like for business use, okay? And some others are coming out for possibly personal use. Maybe they're going to Netflix and other sites. And so again, we see that digital history. We also see a trust and a risk rating. The risk rating comes in and can actually be numerically computed, which again, your organization can use coming in the door. Hey, is this going to be allowed in or not? Oh, we've got a negative risk rating. That's bad. And you can decision off that. In a much simpler form, we can actually say, okay, we're going to just use this digital identity network to do an accept, maybe send it off to review, or a flat out reject. And we'll put in very clear, items that the organization needs to see that these devices need to meet coming in. And again, we're looking at that digital identity. Best way to think about it, it's like in the old days when somebody knocked on the door, you open the door. If it was a bad guy or not somebody you were expecting, you might have a situation there, especially in an urban setting. We just don't know, especially these days. It's just lots of stuff on the news. Now comes the Ring doorbell. Think of the digital identity network as, in a way, being the Ring doorbell. It's giving you visibility where you didn't have it before. It's allowing you to see, a picture worth 1,000 words, a full-blown image of whoever this person is at the front door. It might be no one. It could be the neighbor just did a ding-dong ditch and ran off. It could be somebody's out there and maybe they didn't ring the doorbell, but you see an alert. Oh, what's going on out there? And maybe they're stealing your packages. We don't know. But the reality is you now have the ability to make this risk decision before opening the door, before letting that user in. And in the case of your portals, we can actually do a risk decision before we allow them to even log on or authenticate or set up an account. All of these evaluations can take place during that workflow. Very, very powerful position to be in. So what we've done is two things. We've created this very powerful tool, and we've allowed decisioning be made before any kind of action took place that could lead to what we described earlier, all of these, data breaches and breakage in the portal or malicious authorized user actions. None of that will take place if we see too much risk coming in the door and we decision it out, saying, no, reject, you're done, you're not coming in. And what this is really doing is, this is huge in the anti-fraud space. First of all, 3.5 million exposure, fraud, basically multi-organization. So we're actually seeing the numbers drop, which is huge. That's what was first use was seeing. But the next thing we're going to look at is, how does this affect the remote home user? Next slide, please. And here's a depiction of some of the threats we see from, again, this remote workforce, what's going on right now. And what it's doing is it's testing our current IT infrastructure. So in many cases, we've seen some technologies that are showing their age. So let's talk about a few of these. First of all, username and password, old as the hills. We've had this kind of authentication forever. Its effectiveness has just really diminished. So we came up with things like one-time password via email or SMS. Okay, so you hear about this multi-factor authentication. Please enable it. Life's good. Problem is, not a lot of organizations to this day have even enabled it. In fact, we've seen in many cases, still in the 90% of organizations not enabling multi-factor. The other problem is when they send the one-time password, where does it show up? Typically on a SMS enabled smartphone. Okay, so who has the phone? I mean, couldn't it be potentially stolen? You just send an SMS to the guy that stole it and it's still operating and shows the code. They don't even need to unlock it in most default configurations. Oops. So really what we're seeing there is it only proves that a code was received by what we think was the device that it was supposed to be received by. It still doesn't prove that the user is who he or she is supposed to be. We haven't really vetted them properly. And then we get into KBA, which is knowledge-based authentication. That has had a black eye. A lot of organizations are getting away from it. It still hasn't gone away. And I'll give you a couple of scenarios where it probably is not what you want to deal with versus one that may make more sense. And the one you don't want to deal with is, well, certain state agency, let's put it at that, used only KBA. And they actually had a pretty good tool. And it was asking questions. And the problem was the people would not pass the knowledge-based authentication. They kept failing. So what they would do then is call the call center and say, hey, I can't get through. I'm not really. And what they were trying to do was get benefits. This is for unemployment being handed out by a certain state out on the West Coast. And you might have read about it in the news. But long story short, way too much money was handed out under false pretense. Essentially what happened was the bad guys and gals called up these call centers, socially engineered them, and knew enough about whoever that individual is they're trying to pretend to be, that they got away with it. And then ended up getting checks. And, $650 million later, it was a really bad headline that finally came out months later. Okay, so that's how KBA can be used where it fails. Because actually what took place, the KBA was working. The reason they were failing, they were not the individuals. They were not passing the test because they were coming in, it turns out, from Canada, Europe, Eastern Bloc. Your mind can imagine where else. And what it really illustrates is that KBA by itself is not a workflow. It is not a single solution. It is not that magic box you can put in the rack like you used to years ago to solve all your problems. And because security is a moving train, it keeps changing its vectors. And because the bad guys have a network and this whole digital identity has now come into the space, we need something more powerful. So what we typically see is KBA is still in use, but it'll be at the end of a workflow. This will be after we've done a digital identity risk assessment. Okay, so they've come in the door and maybe now they've got a pretty good risk rating. Maybe it's in a little bit in the positive space, but not enough. Maybe they're coming from a new device and we want to make sure it's them. And so we actually do some additional checks. So we'll do the identity proofing at that point. Now, identity assurance is the risk evaluation on the device, seeing if the digital identity exists, seeing what other devices we're up to, making that whole call. Now, identity proofing is where we actually take apart the first name, last name, mailing address, phone numbers, maybe social security number, whatever we are going to require. And then we pass that through a massive identity engine that is linking everything together. So you have an ID tied to that individual. And what's interesting about this, if it's done correctly, it's actually rebuilding those linked identities every month. And what you end up with is a very, very powerful solution. It's based on reliable data that continually gets updates. And in some cases, you can actually have it subscribe for alerts for any changes to that identity. So if this individual suddenly starts changing addresses, moving around, that's a very powerful solution. We're seeing a lot of state level organizations using it, things like SNAP benefits. Unfortunately, there are people out there that were just traveling state to state to state and applying for benefits and getting them. And what a tool like that can do is actually say, wait a minute, your address shows that you're in Northern Virginia, and why are you applying for benefits in Georgia? And reject it flat out. So that's good. So again, we can begin to see that the workflow will solve the problem. Now, the users coming in and potential phishing attacks continue to take place. What is that? That's a crafted email that appears to come from a source that is trying to trick the user. And what they're trying to do is appeal to their emotions. In the case of COVID-19, World Health Organization, there are all sorts of these emails floating around. Hey, help the World Health Organization. We want to track your whereabouts and, see if there's any COVID in your environment, if any family members got it, and let us know, and click here for the app. And they download it, install it, and the next sound you hear is boom, because that was not a World Health Organization app. And this is just happening left and right. And part of what's contributing to it is, unfortunately, we're in this work from home mode right now. And the good news is we're still able to work in many cases. The downside is, you call it cabin fever, call it being pent up. Our lifestyles had come to a screeching halt in many cases. A lot of people don't travel anymore. They don't even physically go to work anymore. They don't have the social interaction. And that's a problem. And it unfortunately impacts their psyche, their ability to do their job. So what ends up happening is the vulnerability goes up. And so things like phishing attacks actually see a higher success rate because of it. Again, the users are worn down. They're like, oh, I want to help this organization. And they again, suspension of skepticism at that point. They click on it, whatever. The same thing with their phones. They go out to the Google Play Store. And, one of the things I have an opinion about Android is that it just needs to go away. It's so chock full of security threats and vulnerabilities right now. And I think that's actually the plan going forward. The other thing is user experience. We talk about something called zero trust. This comes up a lot, which is, do we really want to end up punishing our users? Because what zero trust does is, I don't trust you. I don't trust your device. We're going to make you jump through every level of friction we can. And that's a problem, because putting all that friction on users is going to end up really making it for a bad experience. And that's the last thing we want to do to our customers. We don't want to have them jump through all those hoops and still not get in. You don't want to punish your users that you should be allowed in, the actual users. So we're going to look at that next. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how this digital identity assessment takes place. A good way to think about it, we can use the TSA model, but think of it as an interesting checkpoint at the front door. So again, if you've got, power utility customers coming in, the first thing that'll happen is we'll do a script that'll allow us to pull the attributes out of their device. And we'll maybe get a little bit of a PII from them, maybe a first name, last name, or phone number, or something like that. And we'll use that to then look up the digital identity. Again, I can't stress this enough. What's happening is we're making a risk decision before we allow them to create that account, before we let them log in. And that's huge, because once the account's created and once the username, password, and whatever method they're going to use to connect is in place, there's really blind trust at that point that the users who they say they are, they're using the same account, everything's great, we're not really doing any additional checks. And that can be a problem. Again, we've seen where, not checking leads to disaster. 80+% of our authorized users, the threat still comes in that space, meaning 80% of your threat is authorized users. So that's an issue. So again, think Ring doorbell, think the ability to see ahead of time, that visibility, and have a decision made before we let them in. And that's a good story. Next slide, please. Now, I'd mentioned this earlier, layered security approach. What does that mean? Well, let's go through the steps. Digital identity assessment, okay? What we're trying to do is identity assurance. Is this in fact George, or because it says it's George and maybe it's George's iPhone, or is it a device in use by somebody else? Or is it a George's device, but maybe it's being remotely controlled? There's all these different aspects. We're also going to look at the risky behavior, maybe that device or other devices George used in the last 24 or 48 hours, however far back we need to go, to find out whether there's trust that we can establish or if there's high risk. Now, if we've seen George before and our crowdsourced digital identity network also has a good, solid digital history of George, interesting thing will happen. We can actually set up what's called trust tags. And what will happen next is our workflow will then become a little more streamlined. And what you're actually doing is you're rewarding your authorized users that come in with good, low risk, high trustworthy behavior, because you have that visibility into their, not just that device, but all of their devices and all of the digital history that they've had. Like, again, that decision can be made. That's great. Okay, so our digital identity assessment's done. Second layer of defense, we're going to look at the physical identity assessment. And what we're going to do there is, let's see, the name, address, phone, if it lines up, or if this is someone, again, that is hopping around doing what we call velocity attacks, possibly. That's where they just hit sites over and over and over and just keep doing it. It could be even a bot. Again, we need to differentiate whether or not the information presented is consistent. We look for that linked identity piece on the physical identity side to see if it lines up. Third layer, that's where we're going to get into that authentication. Okay, so one thing to think about, okay, we talked about multi-factor authentication. It is somewhat dated. And what I want to throw out there is this idea. It's kind of interesting. What if we could combine knowledge-based authentication with multi-factor or SMS? So what will happen is, let's say your call center wanted to send out, a verification for authentication at this stage. And what they end up doing is, say the person has called in, we can actually present to them a question that we pulled from their linked identity database. Something about maybe a license they applied for, like maybe they're a pilot. And we would ask something like, what was the tail number of the plane that you got a license for? And of course, that user would know it. That's not common knowledge either. And we would combine it with an SMS. And in the SMS, it would actually see the answers. And you type in the code for the correct answer. You've done two things. You actually used knowledge-based authentication in an effective way, and you pushed an SMS to at least confirm the device. And they had to get into the device to actually respond to it. So it's a really, really much more powerful solution, much better way to go. And finally, the layer of defense, that fourth layer, is investigation and review. That's where analytics takes over. And that's where you really need the platform to not only give your team the ability to do some workflow. So let's say we've got a questionable case. Maybe the user is claiming to be that, so who they say they are, but again, the risk rating is not lining up. We need to investigate, is that legitimate or not? Or maybe there's some kind of unknown threat. We're seeing this stuff appear and then it disappears. And we're like, what's going on there? Okay, we need to investigate. Again, tools will do that. Next slide, please. When this is all in place and you have workflow, these are the results. And with LexisNexis, we see this. And really, for every dollar in fraud, the organization costs, as you can see there, $361, $366. That's what it costs them to deal with that fraud. Those costs come down. So really, it's a no-brainer. It pays for itself. If you look at the percentages of the fraud as well, and charts on the right, same thing. We're cutting them like less than half. It's a substantial step forward. So when you go to do return on investment calculation, it's pretty straightforward stuff. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? How do we do this threat prevention? We're actually going after the identity through, again, digital identity and behavior risk assessments. It's automated. You read about it afterwards. This is what's decisioning on the sessions as they come in. We use a rules-based policy that performs that risk assessment. Every organization is different, so that policy is tuned and adjusted for your organization's requirements. There is no software, there's no hardware, no endpoint agents. We essentially put some script tags on a web portal facing the internet, and everything's good. It is actually encouraged to be tuned and adjusted. And what's interesting about that is we used to recommend quarterly to see if your results coming in and potentially unknown sessions are numbers that are okay, if they're healthy or not. We can make those adjustments. What we often see, though, is because of COVID, now we've got organizations asking us, no, we want to do this monthly. We really need to see what's going on, see whether this is lining up. When you do this, you're essentially future-proofing against identity threats. Why? Because not only do we have a rich digital identity environment that we have through this digital identity network, but we have new capabilities coming out of it. Things like behavioral biometrics. We can actually now pull data out of the device itself and analyze whether or not a human is actually using it. We can actually tap the sensors data and see whether or not they're, moving a finger across the screen as opposed to a script. And that can do some interesting baseline and risk decisioning. We see this a lot in banks and e-commerce sites, and a lot of us use these banking apps. In a lot of cases, this stuff's already in the app. It's really a good, really positive story. We like that. Next slide, please. So we get wrapping up here, the power of digital identity assurance. We do the risk assessment before they come in the door. Think ring doorbell. We layer it on top of existing identity verification. What we see is identity access management. If you have one of your vendors, say, is Okta or IBM, or Ping, all these identity players out there, they're actually partnering with us. And what we're doing is we're doing that front door evaluation through our threat metrics service. And basically what that does is it provides, again, the risk decisioning before they onboard, before they log in. And again, we're solving the problem. We've got a network to fight a network. It's doing its job. We also see that there's a single view of customer employee digital identity across the portals, prevent external threats and so forth. And most part is we're reducing friction. The customer experience actually does get improved at this point. And that, I think, wraps up our material. Let's go to the next slide, Blake. So we can open up the lines for Q&A. What do we have?
Okay, great. Thank you, George, for that great presentation. I see we do have a few questions, so I'll read those to you, George. But if anyone else has questions, please type them into the chat box along the right-hand side of your screen. So our first question is, what do future digital identity threats look like, and how can we protect our online customer portals?
That's a great question. Well, again, we were talking about future proofing, and really what we need to do is look more and more into both behavioral and purely biometric. What's happening now is we're beginning to see identity assurance going down a stronger path. The way we do that is things like facial recognition, fingerprints, other forms of identity that cannot be forged, things that are, proving the individual is who they say they are. And the credential store access to do that does depend on the platform. It does require additional, development of the software, and we're seeing that happen more in the app space. So devices, when they load an app, potentially will have that. You're seeing that actually more and more in some of the apps you use right now, especially in the financial side of the world. They will ask you to present your fingerprint or your facial ID, whichever your phone has, and that's good. Next question.
Great. Okay, so we hear a lot about ransomware attacks lately. Does this include threats to online identities?
That's the scary part. For years, this was always coming up, and it's like, oh yeah, well, they encrypted all your files. You got to restore from backup. Don't pay the guys. The FBI is telling them, don't pay them. Well, what's happening is organizations are paying them. Why? Two reasons. They need that data back, and the other one is they're holding for ransom the fact that they exfiltrated data from that organization. And there was a case in the news just recently. It was Canon, the guys that do copiers and cameras and whatnot. They actually had their entire annual marketing plan exposed on the internet because they didn't pay the ransomware guys. And that, that privileged information was then published to the world.
Wow. Okay, so the last question I see for now, but again, if anybody has any, please type them into the chat box. What are the pros and cons of biometric authentication? And does it solve all problems or does it create more?
That's a great question. Ultimately, it is the end-all solution to prove you are who you say you are. But then I heard an interesting story that one of the research analysts was presenting, and this is a couple of years ago when fingerprint was pretty common on iPhones and whatnot. And his kid went up to took his phone, and while his dad was sleeping, put his thumbprint on the fingerprint ID. So yes, it's powerful, but could it be misused? Absolutely. And really the workflow solves that. We need to see whether or not the individual is who they say they are, not just say from a fingerprint, but again, we're seeing trends where we do telemetry. We're looking at this behavioral biometrics piece. And what we do there's a couple things. We look for markers that indicate, is George actually holding his phone? Are the sensors producing numbers that make sense? Or is it sitting in a tray like some of the bad guys do, where there's like hundreds of these cloned devices, all running scripts in a data center? I kid you not. And again, that's something we can pick out. But the workflow is important. You really need to see multiple layers as we come in to make sure it is who they say they are. And another form that really impacts this is family fraud or friendly fraud. My wife's an estate attorney and she deals with this all the time. Family members trying to help out poor grandma. Grandma's not real lucid though. She's having some health challenges. And so maybe the daughter or the niece or somebody comes into the picture. Now you got a problem, because we have to trust that it's grandma's identity that's being used here, but we're not clear as to what the motive is. And in too many cases, we see things like account numbers change or mailing addresses change, and now checks that were being sent to grandma suddenly are going elsewhere, or accounts get cleaned out. It's pretty crazy, but a workflow will solve that.
Okay, great. So we have someone who would like you to explain a little bit more about the web portal to validate the identification at the front door.
Absolutely. That's a great question. The thing is, you don't want to rely on the portal for vetting identity at that point. What we're saying is we need to, outsource that. We've already done it with identity and access management, say for employees. So the pings, the Oktas, IBMs, that's what they do. And that's the front end. What we're saying is we're going a step further. For digital identity assurance, we need to have on the portal some script tags. And they're put in usually in a function call like click OK to proceed or click next. And when they do that click, that function call would contain the script tag, which would be fired off. And we could actually begin to then go into the device, pull attributes out. And as they're putting in information, say they're trying to apply for an account, we can take the name, maybe the phone number, combine it with the attributes that have been streaming down to ThreatMetrix real time, and put them together into an API call. And that call goes into ThreatMetrix's digital identity network, looks it up, sees what we got. Apply. Now, what happens next is your policy is applied. So we actually have rules that your organization has set up for what it is you want to allow or not allow, what you consider high risk or low risk. And then at that point, you have a decision. And that's the front door. So I hope that answers your questions on that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't see any more questions. If anyone has one they want to ask, if you could go ahead and type it in the chat quickly. Otherwise, if you think of a question after we end the webinar, please feel free to email membership@publicpower.org, and we'll make sure to connect you with George so that you can get your questions answered.
Yeah, and on a closing note, I did want to mention a tidbit worth considering. This has come up in discussion of some, shall we say, revelations. Again, Checkpoint Software was at Black Hat a couple weeks ago and revealed 400 vulnerabilities that were pulled out of Snapdragon Qualcomm-based Android phones. And what that means is the way they compile the OS and how the apps work within that device have essentially very sloppy code. 400 vulnerabilities is how that compiler works. Long story short, this affects 1 billion devices. And to further complicate things, in security patching, most vendors draw the line after 3 years. The device is 3 years, they're no longer going to support it. They're not going to do security updates. And if you're relying on that device to connect in securely or do multi-factor authentication or what, you got a problem there.
Wow. Well, George, that was a great presentation on a really important topic. So I just want to thank you for a job really well done, and also thank LexisNexis for hosting this webinar for us on this really critical topic. And thank you, all of you, for participating. And again, within 24 hours, we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who attended, as well as those who weren't able to make it, with a copy of this presentation and the slides. So you can rewatch it at your leisure if you need to, or again, reach out to us at APPA if you have questions, and we'll hook you up with the right folks at LexisNexis. Thanks a lot, and have a great rest of your day.